It's important to remember that we all shall pass away as a flower of the grass of the field. That our life is here is but a moment, but a vapor. Look at verse 11. For the sun is no sooner risen with the burning heat, but it withereth the grass, and the flower thereof falleth, and the grace of the fashion of it perisheth. So also shall the rich man fade away in his ways. So we see it particularly identifying that the rich man, so that he should not be so, recognizing that his life's longevity is limited in the same way as the poor. We all have the same opportunities before us in that sense that we have the same lifespan. And Solomon made great examination regarding the ways of this world. The sun rises, the sun sets, the seasons come, the seasons go. We're born, we live, and we die. Everyone the same way. And when we depart with nothing. But the fact that our life is but a vapor, it soon passes away. That we should be mindful of that, and for this cause we are exhorted to redeem the time, for the days are evil. We should take advantage of the time that we have here. But as it regards this, that the man who is wealthy should not consider himself so great, because he soon passes on this world. He's just like everybody else. And as the image here is, the sun rises with burning heat and withers the grass. We can refer to other Old Testament scriptures that reveal about particularly how the east wind or the south wind would bring the dry and arid, yeah, the dry hot air, and would wither the crops, and sometimes would cause crop failure. We can go to Ezekiel 17:10. We can go to Jonah 4:8. Isaiah 40 verses 6 through 8. We can see just how the southern wind, or the eastern wind in the other cases, dries out the crops. It's a hot blast. Look at Job 14 verses 1 and 2. Job 14 verses 1 and 2. And can someone read those verses, please?
Job 14, 1 through 2.
Oh, okay, yes.
A man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not.
Okay. Also showing that the brief period that we hear upon the face of the earth, and the image here is alike, that the flower comes but it's cut down, or and so also Psalm 103 verses 15 and 16. Can someone read those two verses?
As for man, his days are like grass, as a flower of the field soon flourishes. For the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place remembers.
In this case, it's totally passed away, and there's no remembrance. And Solomon made the observation as well that, as a rich man or a powerful man, and as he lives, and then as he dies, and he's buried, and it's not very long before he's forgotten. Okay. And lastly, 1 Peter 1:23. Many of you will probably recognize this passage. 1 Peter 1:23. It uses the same image as regarding the grass, the field, the flower of the grass. Can someone read 1 Peter 1, verse 23?
Having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible, through the word of God, which lives and abides forever.
Okay, go ahead and read the next two verses too.
All right.
Okay. So as our lives are like the flower of the grass of the field, as it grows, the grass, but the flower of the grass, it's beautiful when it blooms and it blossoms, and but it will soon fade away. When we cut flowers and we try to show our love for our wives, and so we bring a bouquet of flowers and hand it to them, and they quickly cut stems off, set them in a vase or vase, and water it and all that stuff. But it's not very long that the flowers begin to wither, not being connected to the vine. But as those flowers wither, the petals drop off, and so does the flower of the field, which is still, its roots are still implanted in the earth. The flower still fades and falls off. We see that the seasonal flowers, that they don't last very long, and the petals fall off, and the grass withereth, and the flower thereof fadeth away. That's our lives. There's another passage I didn't write this down as a reference, but what is our life? It's but a vapor. How long does a vapor last? When you put the water in the teapot and you boil the tea or the water, and when it comes out as steam, the whistle blows and you see the steam. For how long do you see that steam? But for a brief fraction of a second, as the steam comes out from the spout, and you see it's vapor right there by the spout, but it soon disappears. That's our life, particularly respect. And as the Peter writes, the word of the Lord, however, it endures forever, ever. So when we consider that our lives are so short upon this earth, it might not seem to us, especially for children. It might not seem like that, but after we've passed through it, I haven't passed through this life yet, but there are events that we look forward to and we wait with anticipation, and then when it comes and it goes, it seems like it didn't last very long. And as I can imagine that as we pass from this world, our spirit departs from the body, it goes to the Father who gave it, and is directed to the Hadean realm, whether it be paradise or whether it be torment. But especially in paradise, as one waits there, there are souls that have been waiting for the last day, for judgment, for millennia. Okay, but how long would their life seem to them, having gone through that? So it would seem reasonable that they recognize it's so short, and therefore, as James writes about that the attitude of the rich should not be so proud or arrogant, because he's going to die rapidly. And the wealth that he's had, well, what's going to happen to it? Well, Solomon wrote about that. So the rich will fade away in his ways. And then he goes on to, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Now remember, this is all about verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Okay, so all of this is about that within the context. So when we look at blessed is the man that endureth temptation, when your faith is tried, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Now, this would be the entire trial of life, because we know that we don't receive that crown of life until when? When do we receive that crown of life? When we pass away. And who will receive that crown of life? Those that are faithful. And that those who have passed the test, as it were, those who have faced their trials and been patient, enduring it, having endured this life, and when we pass from this life, we will look forward to that crown of life. And then he goes into about what is the attitude? Some people, when they see, did everybody get enough rain yesterday? Did anybody you didn't get enough rain? I know. Did anybody happen to look outside at the highest point of the wind? Did anybody? I looked out and it looked like a hurricane. I grew up in Florida, so I know what a hurricane looks like when in a hurricane. And it was, I heard that south of us, they had like 80, 90 mile per hour winds. So it was like hurricane gales. They were powerful. And you look out the yard, we had sticks all over the yard, sticks and branches and all over the streets. We even saw a huge oak tree completely uprooted, just, and that the roof stood up. I mean, the roots stood up almost as high as the tree itself, and so it was an amazingly powerful wind. Um, and so. But when people look at these things, especially, I mean, we had the safety of our homes, to stay in, and I don't think anybody of us suffered any tragedies. But when the weather storms are so horrific and the winds so strong that people lose their lives, whether it be through flooding or just obstacles being thrown around by the wind or tornadoes like such, and they look at that, and of course you've heard the term, an act of God, and so I know when you talk about an act of God, you mean it's a weather related or something like that, or like earthquakes, something beyond man's control, because he can't control the powerful forces of the earth, and so obviously it's outside of man's control. And you go back to the Old Testament, where God did bring calamities upon people, like the Egyptians and the plagues that he brought them. Other things like causing the earth to split, and 3,000 souls fell into the pit that had been made, who were rebelling against Moses. You might have heard of Korah's rebellion. Okay, these events that are biblical in extent, and power, and we recognize that. So, but when we give God the credit for these powerful things, we recognize the power of God. But when we accuse God of bringing this stuff upon people for their suffering, that's where we get into the mistake, and that's what James is dealing with here in verse 13. Let not man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Don't blame God for things that he doesn't do. People accuse God and blame God for things that it's not his fault. We can look at just sin. We know that there are consequences to sin. We can look to the drug addict. We can look to the alcoholic. And we can see that he has brought his problems to himself because of what he has been doing, abusing his body like that, injecting these items that alter his mental state, and that does health damage. It damages his health. And furthermore, because of his behavior, it damages relationships. And it ruins families. It ruins all sorts of relationships. People lose their jobs because of their incapacitation, their inability to function correctly when they're under the influence of whatever substance they're using. We could also look at just sin in all sorts and forms: lying, stealing, cheating, all these things that damage relationships and damage other people and their situation. And so we know that sin is the cause of all our suffering. Oh, you say, well, no, wait a minute. What about hurricanes? What about tornadoes? Okay, let's consider the way the world was when God created it. It was beautiful. In fact, from all evidence in the scriptures, there was no rain. Okay, God watered the earth from a mist that came from the ground. So we can only imagine, speculate, make educated guesses, or as to what the world was like, the environment was like in those days, and it would seem more friendly, more user friendly, as we might say. And so, but when Adam and Eve, well, actually, even further on after Adam and Eve, even in the days of Noah, when mankind was, their mind was always on evil, and so therefore God decided, I will destroy the earth, destroy humanity, saving Noah and his family. The whole earth was destroyed because of sin. That was an act of God, yes, but he was righteous in his choice. Now, after that flood, and after all the earth's waters were opened up, after all the volcanoes went off, after all the tectonic plates were formed, perhaps, but after they had been moved, after the mountains had been jutted up from the recesses of the earth, all these things occurring, and then we no longer had this firmament, or this layer of water about the earth to protect us from cosmic rays, to protect us from all sorts of things, and now we have new weather patterns. We have different atmospheric pressure. We have a lot of things, storms. Okay. And so, what am I getting at in all this? Ultimately, the reason that we even have these treacherous storms is because of sin. Okay. Am I going too far in this supposition and this assertion? Well, I think that it's reasonable to believe these. Okay. Ultimately, everything we suffer is because of sin, because God made a perfect world for mankind. But because of sin, it has been fractured. Everything doesn't work the way it was when God created it. Okay, so when we attribute to God things that he didn't do, we're making a grave mistake. And so James is dealing with this. Let no man say when he's tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man, tempting him with evil. Does God test us? The term tempt has two different meanings. And here we see we can be tempted with evil, that we're tempted to sin. That's what Satan does for us. He goes around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. He's our adversary. He's going to try to get us to be lost again. He's going to try to get us to sin again. And so he uses every tool at his disposal to try to get us to do that. Things to beguile us, to fool us, to cause us to think that we're okay. Okay, and yes, to think that because everybody else does this, I'm okay because I'm not nearly as bad as everybody else. Okay, but and so Satan will use all these tools at his disposal to cause us to stumble, to turn against God, to curse God. And so Satan is the tempter for evil, but God is the tempter for good. God will give us opportunity to do good. So yes, he does tempt us in that sense. He tries us is a better term that more in what our vernacular, how we would use it. He will give us opportunity to test our faith. But as we see here, let no man say when he's tempted. James is talking about sin. It says, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Okay. When he's talking about evil, he's talking about sinful evil. There's references to the Old Testament about God bringing evil to the people. It's not that he's bringing sin against them. He's bringing judgment against them because of their behavior, their sinful behavior. So he's bringing evil that is like he brought evil to Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah, that was. Did he do evil when he did that? No, he's righteous. He judged them accurately, correctly. And the same way that did he bring evil to the earth when he brought the Noah's flood? Yes, he brought evil to it in the sense of it was a bad calamity. It was, but it wasn't sinful evil. It was because of man's sinful evil that those things, that God brought these things against them. But as far as evil in this context, he's talking about the temptation to sin. And so now James actually deals with the soul, the core of man's sin problem. Yes, we know we have Satan who is tempting us from every side, every opportunity he has, and he will use even our own attitudes against us. He will use opportunities. When we recognize ourselves, I don't know if this ever happened to you, where you start to recognize a bad attitude, and within minutes you're gonna explode. Okay, and in your explosion, you may not do things that are right. Okay, but you recognize it. Well, that's what I'm saying. Satan will use opportunities like this to get you to sin. But when the final analysis, whose fault is it? When we sin, whose fault is it? Our own. As we see that in verse 14, this is the origin of sin, and if we recognize this pattern, we are equipped with a powerful tool to avoid sin. Verse 14, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So we have it's based on the context. We have desires. Okay. We have desires that need to be met, being that as we live in the physical, but we also have spiritual desires that need to be met too. such as our desire for social interaction, our desire to be loved, and desire to love. So we do have spiritual needs too that need to be met. Um, but then a lust, that's something else. It is an inordinate desire. It is a desire so strong that we're willing to do anything to satisfy. Well, at least, to an extent. We're willing to do things to a certain extent that really is sinful. Okay. Such as, man, I'm hungry. I need to be fed, so I need food, but I don't have any money in my pocket. That red apple on that fruit stand looks really good. And I'm not saying that any of us would be tempted with that, but it's a classic where you walk by the apple and slip in your pocket and walk away. I say you. I'm not saying, but and of course you've seen the old movies where the man is caught, if this happens to be a Far Eastern country, and they're going to take him. They're going to lop off his right hand because he stole that apple. Okay, but the hunger has allowed him to lust instead of satisfying that desire in a good way. So as we have our desires, when they become the lust that we're willing to and to do something sinful to acquire or satisfy our appetite, our desire, then that lust. And so as every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. As there's a note in my margin that word lust is also desires. Okay, so we're drawn away by our own desires and enticed, just like Eve was, when the serpent, when Satan had approached Eve and beguiled her with his double talk, saying, "You shall not surely die." So after having caused doubt in Eve, especially that God did not want her to eat that fruit, because if she did, that she'd become as wise as God and see clearly as God sees. Okay, and so having removed the personal prohibition it became more agreeable to her to eat of that fruit. She saw it was good for food. It was nutritious. Okay. So she was drawn away of her own lust there. We have the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life are the three ways that Christ had been tempted. And so we're tempted in the same way, as it says. So Christ was tempted as we were, in the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. The lust of the flesh is that which satisfies fleshly desires, with hunger, thirst, and all the other aspects, the appetites that God has put in us. The lust of the eyes is what looks, it appeals to my ego. Well, appeals to what looks good to me. It just says Eve looked at that fruit. She saw it was good for food, so it was the lust of the eyes. And then there's the pride of life, and that's probably the how are there so many different ways to get this? How would you describe the pride of life?
Dethroning God by saying that you're all sufficient.
Good.
You feel like you can take care of everything. And
Okay.
dethroning God, you're saying, okay, I can take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you say I can take care of it, then you're patting yourself on the back and saying it's all based on what I can do, and you don't give God any of the glory.
That's very good. Yeah. As we think about become self-sufficient, when we use that term self-sufficient, we often and we like to train up our children to be self-sufficient. That is, when there is a goal they need to achieve, and we teach them to utilize the resources that are at their disposal. They use their wits about them to figure out, how do I take care of this? And it's industriousness. We want to teach our children to be industrious, productive, all these things. And so we use the term self-sufficient. In fact, in our homesteads, we like to think of being self-sufficient. We aren't reliant upon a welfare state. These things we look at as good for everybody, good for our country, and good for everybody to be independent to that level. But as Jenna brought to mind, that when we say that we can do it ourselves apart from God, That's the pride of life. And we think that we can take care of anything. Self-made man, all this stuff. So as we look at the pride of life, it's an arrogance. It's beyond self-sufficiency. It's beyond confidence in being able to deal with things. It's I can take care of it by myself, and without relying upon God. Yes. Look at what I built. Look at these great edifices I built. And right before he was cursed with being a beast. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we know we're enticed by our lusts. In verse 15, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And it's interesting the terms that are used. We know that in our physical life, we are conceived. Before we ever are, we're conceived and become a human being. Animals are conceived. They become whatever animal that from their parents. And then we know that to enter into the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus told Nicodemus, we must be born again. And we know we're not born of ourselves. We were begotten by his will. We were begotten by the will of God. So we are born in the Spirit, born according to born of water and the Spirit, as Jesus made note to Nicodemus. And so we are born again, apart from being born physically, but now we are spiritually born, having been a renewed life, renewed by that seed. We're born of the seed of the Word of God, that incorruptible seed. But here we see that lust is conceived. Lust conceives to bring forth sin. So that as we have our parents, that when we are conceived of our parents. Here, sin is conceived by its parents, lust. And sin, when it's finished, bringeth forth death. When it's finished, or when it comes to completion or fruition, when it's matured, when it's full grown, that death comes from it. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. So that when we look at the source of sin, yes, Satan is roaming around seeking whom he may devour. He's using tools to entice us, okay? But it all comes down to our own lusts. Do we have our appetites under control? Do we recognize that we're living in the Spirit, so whatever appetites we have is under our Spirit's control, that we decide what we're going to eat, when we're going to eat it, and we decide how we're going to attain it, and we're not going to be manipulated into and drawn around by the nose to achieve our goals in a sinful way. And so he's warning us, and with this understanding of whatever desires I might have, keep them in check. Paul said he keeps his body in check. He buffets his body daily. He's not going to become a servant of things. He's not going to become a servant of the physical. Rather, he's the one that will be in control. And verse 16, do not err, my beloved brethren. Do not err. Do not be deceived. And whether that's attached to what we just read or if it's attached to the next section, doesn't matter. That we can be beguiled, we can be deceived, whether it be regarding the origin of sin and how to deal with it, or whether it be regarding God. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. That, I would say, it attaches to both as we look at this. We should not be deceived as regards the origin of our own sin. But we should also not be deceived by blaming God for things that he doesn't do. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. The American Standard uses a different, read verse 17 for us, Kara.
Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom can be no variation, neither shadow that is cast by turning.
Okay. No variation or God is always dependable. I hate to use the term. God is always the same. Yeah, but we can depend upon his nature. And the fact that he uses a figure here, just like, when we're in that winter sunlight, when the sun is way deep south and the shadows are long, and we can look down at our shadows, it's 20 feet long, and we say, wow. But as we look, as a boy, I remember playing with the shadows, trying to run away from a shadow, or seeing how big my shadow could get, and all this. But you play and you watch as you turn around in that shadow. You see your nose appear, your ears appear, all these things, and we see the variations as we turn. But with God, He is so much the same, so dependable that even when this is a figure, when He turns in the shadow is always the same. Always the same. Were you going to say something, Jenna? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. So the fact that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. So everything we are blessed with, everything, God's given it to us. Some may delight and gloat in their achievements, in their creativity to gain things, but in the final analysis, God has provided all things, all the resources that we have. He brings the sunshine to the believer and the non-believer. He brings the rain. He brings all blessings to us to sustain us, like he does. It's interesting to note too that, in fact, we read about this in the Psalms and other passages where the recognition is that the sinner, the evil man, he prospers financially in his ways. He makes money at whatever he does. And the faithful one of God looks at this and wonders about, what about me? Look at me. I'm struggling day in, day out just to make ends meet. And I can barely get along. And I look at, and I'm faithful to God, and I would like to think that God would bless me in my faithfulness. But here I am, working as feverishly as I can, and still not being able to make ends meet. And when I look at that man who's evil, sinful, and all, and I wonder, where's the wisdom in this? But of course, the final conclusion is, don't worry, because the day of reckoning for that rich man is coming, whether it be in this life or when he passes from this world. But that all who are faithful to God should be confident that was the right choice. That it's where we need to be. And we can't allow the distraction of wealth and ease of life to cause us to think that they're going to do fare well when it comes to the day of judgment. So we should not I can't think of the words now. We should not have we should not want what they've got. What we see, what they have is not an accurate representation of where they really stand before God. I heard something very interesting just the other day. We talked about happiness, okay? People without any problems, people that were really on all the outside, they seemed so happy and so have it all together. And this one fellow said that his mother said when he was young, a long time ago, and basically it was like, the only people I know who are really happy are people I don't know very well. The only people I know that are happy are people I don't know very well. I thought that was really interesting, that everybody has struggles in this life. Everybody has aspects of their life that they're not completely satisfied with. And to say that when we look at others, whether they have great wealth or whether they put on this front or even fool themselves that they're really happy, if we don't know them better, we might think that they have it all together. But every one of us has difficulties in this life to deal with. Question is, how do we deal with it? And I wrote, and to some extent it does deal with the idea of the calamities that might come our way, the difficulties that might come our way. There's more to the whole equation, and it's an article I wrote in the bulletin, particularly as we learn about our brother and sister in Christ, the Blackwells, Don and Sherry Blackwell. All right, so as we see in here, verse 18, so as we see the origin of sin is that is lust when it conceives to bring forth sin. But what about ourselves? And so we look at verse 18. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So we were born of God, and not because we wanted to be born again, but God decided to bear us. It was by his own will that we were born in the Spirit, as it were. When we're talking about being born of the Spirit, as Jesus told Nicodemus, we must be born of the water and the Spirit. We must be born again before we see the kingdom of heaven. And of course, we were born not with corruptible seed, but with incorruptible, the Word of God. And so we were begat with the Word of truth, that is the Word of God, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Who is it among us who decided to be born when we were born of our parents? It wasn't even we weren't even there to decide to be born, to be conceived. Okay, it was our parents who conceived us. And then again, still, our conception, our spirit still was created by our Father in heaven. And the physical being conceived through the natural procreation process that God has given us. All right. So we were begotten of God by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of creatures. The first fruits of his creatures, back in the Old Testament, they were to, when they were bringing forth crops, the first fruits from the crops, they'd have to when I say have to, God required them to dedicate them to him. Okay. And then after those first fruits, they could partake of the fruits thereof. It's interesting to note that at James's audience, to whom he was writing, and we would assume he's writing to all Christians, all brethren, we would be all kind of fruits of his creatures, so that as we were born of God by his word, that we are dedicated to God. We are his. Much like the Levites were his. Okay. And so he says, wherefore. Now wherefore is like a therefore. It said, because of all of this, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. That's who we are. Consider the nature of God. He's not swift. He is swift to hear. He's slow to speak, that is, and slow to wrath. God is as slow to wrath as we can imagine. He lets things go on and on, that we would think, when is God going to take care of this? Such as in the days of the judges, when the people were being oppressed by the Philistines and other tribes around them, other people around them, and they would cry out to God, or the 430 years that the children of Israel were in captivity to Egypt. I don't think they were in captivity for 430 years, but there were hundreds of years that they were, and they were crying out to God. And as we might say, finally, God chose Moses to send him to deliver him out. God allows things to occur, and so when the right time to fulfill his will comes, then it is done. But as we consider that when he punishes the evildoer, we might think, well, it took a long time. It took so long. But as God gives every opportunity for people to turn away. Think about if we know the wages of sin is death. Romans 6:23. We know that. And as we know that Satan is the great accuser. He accuses us. He accuses God of being unrighteous for letting us live because of our unrighteousness. After all, if we sin, we should die, right? And so the accuser, Satan, accuses God. So You said it, they should die, so why are they still alive? Well, imagine if we were not given the opportunity that we have all had to respond to the gospel. Of all the sins that we have committed in our lives, and then finally we come to ourselves and recognize that, I've really hurt God. I have really sinned against God, and I need him to forgive me. Lucky for us, I say lucky for us, how fortunate for us that God didn't have us removed from the face of this earth, that we were given time to respond to the gospel. And so as we think about how our Father is, and when you talk about being swift to hear rather than jumping into a conclusion, we listen to the evidence. We're told to judge righteous judgment. Well, that's based upon hearing all the evidence. That's swift to hear. Slow to speak. Before we engage mouth, what do? We think. And slow to wrath. In fact, the Bible teaches us not to take vengeance. We'll let God have his vengeance. Okay. We're also taught to live peaceably with all men as much as in us is. We are taught to return good for evil. That we're not to fight evil with evil, but rather we return good for evil. We bless our enemies. We bless them that persecute us. This is because we are the children of God, who hath begotten us of his own will. Okay. In verse 20, and why? For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. That's self-explanatory. That we recognize that our own anger, our own desire to receive retribution for the wrongs they've done against us, that if it's like taking the law into our own hands, as some might say. That we must allow God to take his vengeance, and that rather than returning evil for evil, return good for evil. As he said, the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. All right, we're going to stop there because of the end of the class. We'll begin with verse 21 as we continue in James 1. Are there any questions or thoughts or comments about what we discussed this morning? Okay. All right.